Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep into Canadian history and civics with the Discover Canada Study Guide. It's going to be quite the journey, folks. We're covering everything from, like the first people who lived in Canada to some of the things that make Canada, well, Canada today. By the end, you'll be practically Canadian history experts.
Oh, absolutely. And this guide, it's not just like a boring old textbook,
Yeah.
dates and names and all that. It really captures like the heart of being Canadian.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, like right off the bat, did you know that the name Canada comes from the Iroquoian word Canada, which just means village? I mean, think about that. That's a real reminder that, indigenous people, they were here long before, Europeans ever set foot in Canada.
Oh, for sure. Thousands of years. And their presence isn't just like a thing of the past. It's woven into the very fabric of Canada. Like you said, even the name Canada shows that.
Right. It's like built into the name. And speaking of legacies, the guide talks about, those early European explorers, like
Yeah.
John Cabot in 1497 mapping the East Coast. That, like, really kicked things off, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. Kind of opened the floodgates for more explorers and eventually, colonization.
Can you imagine, like, be one of those early explorers, coming to this, like, totally new land? It must have been mind-blowing.
Oh, totally. And the guide talks about how the fur trade, became like a huge deal pretty quickly. The Hudson's Bay Company, for example, they got exclusive trading rights over a vast area in 1670. It's kind of crazy to think about.
That's a lot of power, right? And it
Oh,
makes you
yeah.
think about how, like, the competition for resources,
Yeah.
things like fur, it really fueled that whole struggle for control between France and Great Britain.
Absolutely. Economics and conflict, always a fun mix. And this eventually led to the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, 1759, right outside Quebec City, a real turning point, that battle.
Yeah.
It cemented British power in the region.
Wow. Must have been quite the event. But, even before Canada officially became Canada, the guide mentioned that there were already, like, experiments with democracy going on. Did you know the first representative assembly was elected way back in 1758 in Halifax?
Yeah, it's surprising, right? Seems like there was this desire for self-governance even in those early colonial days. And as that grew, well, you had people like Sir Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine and Robert Baldwin who were really pushing for responsible government.
So basically, a government that answered to the people, not just the crown. That's pretty cool. I mean, those are like early seeds of democracy being planted.
Hmm.
But it couldn't have been easy, especially with those distinct French and English identities, right?
Oh, it was a tricky situation for sure. The Constitutional Act in 1791, it divided the province of Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada, partly to try and address that, those different cultural identities.
Huh. Must created a whole new set of issues, though, right? Seems like Canada's always had to deal with accommodating different groups.
Oh, it's a recurring theme, that's for sure. And those tensions sometimes, they boiled over. Like in 1837, you had armed rebellions in both Upper and Lower Canada.
Wow. Those rebellions, even though they didn't succeed in the end, they must have been like a wake-up call, right? For the British, I mean. A sign that things needed to change.
Yeah, for sure. Forced the British to rethink things, look at new approaches to governance. In a way, you could argue those rebellions, disruptive as they were, actually helped pave the way for Confederation.
It's like sometimes conflict can lead to positive change, huh?
Yeah.
So how do we go from rebellions to, Canada becoming a nation?
Well, the guide explains that between 1864 and 1867, you had representatives from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, the province of Canada, and of course the British, all getting together to talk about like a framework for a new nation.
Ah, those famous fathers of Confederation. We see them in pictures all the time. But it's easy to forget they were, real people dealing with some pretty huge challenges.
Oh, yeah. They had to figure out how to bring together this vast land with all these different people, different identities, different needs, and create something stable, something that would last.
And they did. I mean, somehow they pulled it off. July 1st, 1867, Canada became a dominion. That's got to be one of the biggest moments in Canadian history.
It was a huge step, that's for sure. Though not full independence quite yet. But then things started moving westward. The guide talks about how Rupert's Land, the Northwestern Territory, became part of Canada. It was a period of big changes, but also, a lot of challenges.
Especially for the indigenous peoples who already lived in those territories, right?
Absolutely. The guide talks about that too. It mentions Gabriel Dumont, for example. He led the Metis resistance against the government. It's a reminder that westward expansion, it wasn't all like sunshine and
Yeah,
rainbows.
there were real costs. And then there's the Canadian Pacific Railway, finished in 1885. That must have been an incredible project for the time.
It's amazing. Connecting the east and west coasts, thousands of kilometers of track, it really became a symbol of national unity and like Canadian ambition.
It's like a testament to what people can do when they work together.
Right. But like we've seen, there were always, tensions and challenges bubbling beneath the surface, things that would shape how Canada developed.
Exactly. And as we get into the 20th century, those challenges, they become even more intense. You've got two world wars, massive social and economic changes. Things are about to get really interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing to think how much things changed in the 20th century. It seems like a pretty defining time for Canada. Lots of highs and lows, according to this guide.
You're right about that. I mean, the two world wars had a massive impact on Canada, both at home and on the world stage. Like, the guide highlights the Battle of Vimy Ridge, in World War I. The Canadian Corps, they won a tough victory there.
I remember learning about Vimy Ridge in school. It seemed like, well, a really brutal battle, lots of casualties. What made it so important in the grand scheme of things? It wasn't just about the military victory, it kind of became this symbol of national unity, of sacrifice. Canadians from all over fighting together for the same cause. Some historians even say, like, that experience, it really helped solidify Canada's identity as a nation.
So even through something as terrible as war, a stronger sense of national unity emerged. That's interesting. And then in World War II, Canada stepped up again, big time. The D-Day invasion, for example.
For sure. Over 1 million Canadians and Newfoundlanders served in World War II. The guide talks about the sacrifices, the courage of those who fought.
It must have been a time of huge anxiety, not just for the soldiers, but for everyone back home, too.
Oh, absolutely. And, the guide also mentions a darker side to that period, the internment of Japanese Canadians. It's something Canada has apologized for since then, but it's a reminder that even when there's this national unity, fear and prejudice they can lead to some pretty bad things.
It's a good reminder to always protect the rights and freedoms of everyone, no matter who they are or what they believe. Speaking of which, the guide mentions that after World War II, Canada started kind of, asserting its independence from Britain more strongly.
Yeah. In 1982, Canada patriated its constitution, meaning it had full control over its own affairs. A big shift in the relationship with Britain after all those years.
And that's when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms became part of the Constitution. All those basic rights, freedom of expression, religion, the right to assemble, equality rights. It's a big deal, right?
Huge. The Charter, it's like a foundation of Canadian values, a symbol of a free and democratic society. It's had a big impact on the law and, just Canadian culture in general.
Yeah, something to be proud of, for sure. But the guide doesn't just talk about rights, it also talks about responsibilities, right?
Yeah.
Like what it means to be Canadian.
Exactly. It's not just about what Canada can do for you, it's about what you can do for Canada, right?
Yeah.
Participating in democracy, respecting the law, being a good citizen, contributing to your community.
It's like a two-way street. We all have a part to play in making Canada better. And part of that is, understanding and respecting our history and our diverse culture. That's a big theme in the guide, right? Multiculturalism as a defining feature of being Canadian.
Oh, absolutely. It's amazing to see how Canada has changed. From those 3 founding peoples to this incredibly diverse country. The guide points out how immigrants from all over the world have enriched Canadian society. They've brought their own cultures and traditions and made Canada what it is today.
Like a big mosaic, right? Each piece adding to the overall picture. And it's a picture that keeps changing as new people come to Canada and make it their home. That's pretty cool. The guide also talks about the oath of citizenship, the one new Canadians take, right? It's a pledge of loyalty to the crown, which seems, I don't know, maybe a bit odd to some people, because Canada is also a parliamentary democracy.
Yeah, I can see how that might seem confusing. But the guide explains that the oath, it's not really about being loyal to, a specific king or queen or even to Britain. It's more symbolic, It's about being loyal to those values, to those institutions that represent all Canadians. The rule of law, democracy, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, things like that.
So it's more about what Canada stands for, not a specific person or country.
Exactly. It's about belonging, and upholding those principles that make Canada unique. But, a country isn't just about ideals and values. It also needs a strong economy.
Right. And the guide doesn't shy away from that. It dives right into Canada's economy. It really highlights that Canada has always been a trading nation.
That's right. It even mentions NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Well, it's called USMCA now, but still. It shows how important trade is, especially with the US. It's a big part of Canada's economic success.
It's crazy. Something like three-quarters of Canadian exports go to the U.S. That's a huge amount. But the guide also says, there's more to Canada's economy than just natural resources.
Totally. It breaks down the key industries into three types. First, there are the natural resource industries like forestry, fishing, agriculture, mining, and energy.
That's what a lot of people think of when they think of Canada, right? The lumberjacks, the fishermen, the farmers. Those industries are like woven into our history.
Then there are the manufacturing industries, which produce all kinds of goods, cars, airplanes, electronics.
Sometimes it feels like manufacturing gets overlooked, but it's still super important to our economy, right?
Mm.
And then there are the service industries. That seems to be a growing area.
Oh, yeah, big time. Service industries are a big chunk of Canada's economy these days. Everything from finance and healthcare to tourism and education. It's part of that global shift towards, a more knowledge-based economy.
So Canada's had to adapt and stay competitive. It's pretty impressive when you think about it. We've covered a lot in this deep dive. Early exploration, Confederation, the World Wars, the Charter. This guide really paints a picture of what it means to be Canadian.
Right. And we're not finished yet. There's still more to explore. The guide also takes us on a tour of Canada's different regions. Each one has its own unique character, shaped by its geography, history, and culture.
I mean, it's just amazing how much variety there is across Canada, right? From
Yeah.
coast to coast to coast. It really comes through in this guide.
It really does. And there are all these fascinating details and stories, that make each region feel totally different. For example, in the Atlantic provinces, you've got the story of Laura Secord. She walked almost 30 kilometers during the War of 1812 through enemy territory, to warn British forces about an American attack.
Wow. That's incredible. It shows you that, ordinary people can do some pretty extraordinary things. Her courage, it helped the British win the Battle of Beaver Dams. Pretty amazing.
Right. It's a great example of how, individual bravery can have a huge impact. And speaking of battles, the guide also talks about Vimy Ridge. World War I, the Canadian Corps won a hard-fought victory there, although a lot of lives were lost on both sides.
Vimy Ridge is often talked about as a defining moment for Canada. What made it so important?
Well, I think it marked Canada's arrival on the world stage.
Yeah.
It showed that Canadian troops were skilled and determined. The guide actually quotes a Canadian officer who was there. He said, "It was Canada from the Atlantic to the Pacific on parade. In those few minutes, I witnessed the birth of a nation." Pretty powerful stuff.
It is. It kind of reinforces the idea that, national identity is often forged through shared experiences, even the difficult ones like war.
Yeah.
But the guide also acknowledges that, Canadian history isn't always a perfect story. There are some darker moments, like the internment of Ukrainian Canadians during World War I.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that governments can make mistakes, even with good intentions, especially during times when people are scared or uncertain. It's important to learn from those mistakes, right?
Absolutely, to acknowledge them and try to do better and to recognize, the resilience of those who were unjustly targeted. It's all part of the story. But on maybe a lighter note, the guide also talks about all the cool inventions and innovations that have come from Canada. The snowmobile, for example, invented by Joseph Armand Bombardier.
The snowmobile,
Right.
Practically a Canadian icon, right? It's like a symbol of our, ability to adapt to tough conditions. And then there's Sir Sanford Fleming. He was a Scottish-Canadian engineer who, get this, developed the worldwide system of standard time zones.
I had no idea. Time zones, a Canadian invention. That's amazing. It's like we've contributed so much to the world in ways we don't even realize.
Exactly. It speaks to the spirit of innovation and problem solving that I think is a big part of Canadian culture. And this guide, I have to say, it does such a good job of bringing all these things together. The big historical events, the political stuff, and then these smaller, more personal stories and achievements. It's really like a tapestry, a rich tapestry.
It really is. It's been an amazing journey exploring this guide. So if someone's listening to this and thinking, hey, I want to learn more about Canada, where would you suggest they go? What resources are out there?
Well, this guide, Discover Canada, is a great place to start, of course, but there's so many other things too. Books, museums, websites, even other podcasts.
Don't forget about actually going places, right? Visiting historical sites, cultural institutions, that brings history to life in a whole different way.
And talking to people, elders, historians, anyone in your community, everyone has a story, and those stories can teach you so much. It's like putting together a big puzzle, you know? Each story adds a new piece.
It's been a pleasure diving into this with you.
Hmm.
So to wrap things up, what's one final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
How about this? The guide says Canadians celebrate the gift of one another's presence. I think that's a beautiful way to describe the spirit of Canada. You know, the inclusivity, the welcoming nature.
Perfect. Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, that's our deep dive into Canadian history, civics, and culture. We've learned about the past, explored the present, and maybe even got a glimpse of the future.
And through it all, I think we've seen that Canada is, a work in progress, a country that's constantly changing, embracing diversity, striving for fairness, valuing everyone's contributions.
It's been a great journey, and I hope you've all enjoyed it. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.